Hi, so big news today. They opened the Capstone on the Salt Lake Temple, and listed in the items was a photograph of Joseph and Hyrum Smith. And what they found were totally damaged, unidentifiable, like there's no photographic image on them at all, because it was 1892. And they put it in wet cement, and then that cement had to dry after they put that stuff in there, and anything that was paper was just destroyed. So it was interesting, it was fascinating to find that source and say they said they had photos of Joseph and Hyrum, and Brigham Young said Emma had pictures of Joseph and Hyrum she wasn't sharing in 1869. And in 1910, Joseph Smith III said in a letter that Lucien Foster took his dad's picture. Why wouldn't he? He was on his presidential campaign, and he had his studio up not long after Joseph Smith's death. Who wouldn't, a month before they opened the studio, practice on the person that hadn't died yet, that he was helping run the presidential bid for? I think he would have had that camera set up and practicing and trying to get that studio ready for longer than just 30 days. But other people don't think he was capable of having a camera before his studio came up. So I don't know, and he probably did travel a little bit, but there were several months before Joseph Smith died that Lucien Foster was in Nauvoo. To look back over the last 3 years and see who I've talked to and what's happened, and I'm just trying to be okay with whatever happens. But if I think what's going to happen happens, I just know I have to myself be mentally and emotionally prepared for it. I'm just hoping other people are too. But yeah, it's an interesting culture in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, especially Utah. And I'm just not a part of it, that sometimes it's just funny. If you go to Utah, I mean, outside of Utah, that's where most of the members are. It's like 14 million out of 15 million of the 16 million members don't live in Utah. But in Utah, they have all these Joseph Smith foundations and Fair Mormon, and like everyone's a historian. Not literally everyone, but there are so many church historians, and we don't really spend money or time criticizing other religions. You won't find us Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints funded video against the Baptists. Like, I found a whole video titled the Latter-day Satans, and I'm like, how could I not click on that? And it was funded by this specific Baptist church. I'm like, why? And then it was a 1970s cartoon, which is so just wrong on so many points, but I won't go into that. But it's interesting, but it's kind of sad that we just sort of criticize each other, but we're not going to agree with each other, and that's okay. Like, for example, I am a huge fan of Rod Meldrum and Wayne May. Their research and that helps support that there's evidence of the Book of Mormon happening here. Like, a lot of these things talked about in the Book of Mormon are here. You just kind of have to watch their videos. And Rod Meldrum, who is not a scientist, but someone from Fair Mormon criticized him for that, and watched one of his videos or read what he'd written. His video that I watched is almost 3 hours long, and I've watched it many times. He has written for scientific journals, though. So he knows how to find, he's written for them, he knows what those are, and so he references a lot of scientific journals talking about haploX2, that there is some, not all Native Americans, some of them have DNA for Israeli DNA, which makes sense, because if you study the Book of Mormon, people have different DNA. It's kind of apparent. And so he starts talking about the Jaredites. So if you're not a member of the church, the Jaredites come from the Book of Ether, which is near the very end of the Book of Mormon. But it's timeline. So Nephi is 600 BC. The Jaredites are thousands of years BC. Basically, it's Tower of Babel, when languages were changed, and then people were scattered all across the earth because they wouldn't stop staying in one little spot, which kind of happens today too. Sometimes we're like, too many people are in this city, we need to kind of spread out, maybe things would be better. But it's sort of hard. It's our human nature to kind of all be together. And God was like, no, I'm going to change your language, so you have to spread out. And after that happened, what else did he do? He changed our skin, he changed our eyes, he changed our height, our muscle, our tendons or work differently to interact with the wildlife and the sun or lack of sun, wind. If you can explain evolution with animals, you can explain evolution with humans. That it's to help us adapt, and we just believe it's God's love and that we all are children of Adam and Eve, that we're all human. We're all brothers and sisters. But that's really what we push in the Church of Christ Latter-day Saints, that we really are all brothers and sisters. So I find that a lot less racist than it's more the atheistic view that is more, says certain nationalities are not even quite as human as others. And to me, that's evil, because that doesn't come from Christianity. But anyway, yeah, kind of this, I've had to roll with the punches, and I've gotten frustrated here and there myself. I just had so much overwhelming things happen, and I kind of talked about this before, but I just was very sick when there was a lot of people talking to me, and I just was like, I don't know, but it really seemed it was mostly negative, but it's been the last year or two that it's been like people that were open-minded, and that's what I have a hard time with. So like with Rod Meldrum, what happened to him was, Fair Mormon, I love their website and I love a lot of their research, but then they have this whole article trying to rip apart his research. And I'm like, you didn't watch his whole video. Kind of like is what I'm saying is the person that looked at my photo initially that was from the church history department, one of so many people that work there. Maybe half of them think there's a photograph of Joseph Smith and half of them don't, because even actual church historians were hoping to find a photo of Joseph Smith late May, and I'm so surprised I just found out about this, but I'm sure they really wanted to analyze it before they published it, that they really, there's just no image on those photos, but I'm sure they used a lot of machinery to try to figure it out, it's just I was sad. I was excited this morning, then I was really sad, because I think there are other photos of my photo that I think is of Joseph Smith. I think it's a copy of another photo, maybe another photo. But it was very obvious this person who wrote for Fair Mormon didn't watch his video, because they start criticizing him, and they do find things that I'm like, I'm not a scientist, maybe that is wrong, but he has an interesting point, because they're like, well, what about all the other Native Americans? They don't have haplo-X2. I'm like, well, yeah. He thinks they were, so like the Lamanites, you got Nephi, Laman and Lemuel, and then several other people go off, and then a couple generations later, their children just have darker skin. Did God, we know that evolution is real. It's not racist that evolution happens. It's God's mercy. But can it happen so quick that Jacob, brother of Nephi, is talking about the different skin tone of the Lamanites? Is the question. Rod's like, they intermarried with the Jaredites, and they weren't all dead. So the Jaredites are thousands of years BC, Asian DNA, and possibly darker skin. And so what is interesting is if you read the book of Ether, and there's this whole paternal line of names of son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, just going on and on and on. It's like, why would Joseph Smith do that? It's just, if you read the whole Book of Mormon, it's pretty astounding how intricate the book is. But I was just like, I wonder, I'm just gonna research how many of these names are Asian. I'm just gonna kind of throw that in there. In the book of Ether. So I think Rod Meldrum was right, but this person didn't watch their video long enough to find that out. Because he can't deny and refute that there are some Native Americans that have similar DNA that were Israeli, but most of the Nephites were wiped out. But I think for just a couple generations in, for God to change their DNA, I think it takes more time than 20 years. So I agree that there must have been some intermarrying with some other people that were already here, which we know if you read the Book of Mormon, we also hear of the Mulekites. They came over. They were also from like Jerusalem. And who's to say it's like some Aryan society in Israel where everyone's the same, someone contended that. I'm like, exactly. I mean, it's true. Jesus talks about there being people, basically African people in Israel. There's people from, I think there were Arabian people that looked like Arabian people today in Israel, but I think that there probably were Caucasian people in Jerusalem too, because I don't know. At that point, it'd been a while since the Tower of Babel. We've went our separate ways, maybe had a spontaneous change of evolution, but then we have traveled and traveled and traveled, but we all kind of have stayed the same. And it's just more when we intermarry that our children might look a little bit like that lineage and that lineage. So it's a really interesting point. And another person I really like is Meg Stout. So I've talked about her before. I really delved into polygamy. I recommend Reluctant Polygamist, and she has blogs online you can read. But it's interesting because her perspective, so she's criticized by other Mormon scholars. Like I'm saying, we criticize each other more than we're going to criticize other religions. And so there are quite a few people that criticize her. Someone, I referenced her to someone, they're like, oh, well, she's not a historian. I'm like, she has important points of Joseph Smith, and maybe it's just women that we feel more, I don't understand it, to be completely frank, but I think it just has a lot to do with actually men in the Church of Christ Latter-day Saints that are especially higher up there, and just our church in general. We don't want to go into the dark stuff, and we don't want to upset women or talk about things, if you watch Joseph Smith papers, they will talk about the horrible things that happen in Missouri, but they don't say a whole lot about the horrible things that happen to women in Alvia, which I don't understand, but Meg Stout does. That's part of it, is men that have been in the High Council like today, you don't talk about those things. And so I think they feel kind of hush-hush because there were people that did bad things in Alvia that repented and came to Utah, but I definitely, was Joseph Smith like Epstein, or was Chauncey Higby more like Epstein? I would definitely say Chauncey Higby, because there are all these testimonials of women, like he wasn't marrying any of them, and he was also finding any women that would be with other men and getting them to be with all these guys in the Nauvoo Legion, or that had been. And so spiritual wifery was definitely not plural marriage. Unauthorized plural marriage was something, it was like Jeffrey Epstein living. It really was a lot like that. And yeah, it was just very, very bad. The details of these things I've talked about, I won't go great detail, but she goes into that. People criticize her, but she's not a historian, but she's a very intellectual person. She's an engineer, and she's someone who, her ancestor was married when she was still to Joseph Smith, and she struggled with that. She's like, and there are several Utahns, but all the statements and all the evidence go to that they are like, oh no, nothing physically happened. And as I researched more and more, researching Joseph Smith III is a great resource. Memoirs of Joseph Smith III. Hearing, once you understand, eternity-only sealings were like being a nun. Whereas time sealings is just like time, and it's just marriage in 2 days, but it's until death do you part. That's time sealing, and so that's your legal marriage, is a time sealing. And members of Church of Christ Latter-day Saints can get married outside the temple, and it'll be like a time sealing. It doesn't, like, I'm an endowed member. I'm not going to lose my endowed status if I marry a non-member, and we're not, it's till death do you part. But if I was married in the temple, it would also include eternity. But when it says eternity only, for whatever reason, Joseph Smith has mass numbers of those, of women being sealed to him for eternity only, a lot that have husbands, women that have husbands on missions, but it really was in the next life. So there were women who had husbands that were not active in the church. So I've talked to 2 people specifically. I don't have pioneer heritage that were in that situation where they had an ancestor, a woman that was a lot older than Joseph Smith in both of these cases, married, but sealed for eternity only, but nothing physically happened. And so members of Joseph III, as he's interviewing all these Utahns, it's consistent. They're telling him, oh, no, spiritual wifery was bad, evil. Plural marriage, and he keeps thinking they're the same like people today. And it's funny once you understand it, that he's so confused as he's quoting these Utahns, but eternity only was, you're not married, which means, no, you don't fornicate in the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's never been okay to have sex outside of the bonds of marriage. So you're not in the bonds of marriage if it's eternity only. And then Helen Mar Kimball said it was eternity only, and then Meg Stout points out that a lot of these apostles were sealed just for eternity. Just sealed is maybe the term that they would use, because they weren't married to younger women. It was like being engaged, so that they already had sort of a commitment there for the next life, because that's already something in the future. We're not there yet. We're not resurrected. So if it's eternity only, you're married when you're resurrected. And that's consistent in members of Joseph Smith III. If a guy that didn't live polygamy, did not grow up near polygamous, and didn't like it, didn't support it, but he's supporting these terms, and then it, just by quoting them and giving his own interpretation, which is funny because he's just all kinds of confused, like us today. And I'm grateful we don't live plural marriage today. I think it would be hard, but I can also see how those men, most members of the church are very grateful for that. I can't speak for all of them, but I do see how it wouldn't necessarily always be abusive or forced, whereas you see Chauncey Higby forcing himself on women, and J.C. Bennett, same thing, just very aggressive. And just your opinion, your agency didn't matter, whereas Joseph Smith, it was very much like he was courting each of them, how they would back then, going to the father or the older brother, whoever was around, and then getting their permission, and then talking to them. And then Emily Partridge lived in his house for years. It's just still, I just can't get over her testimony. It's just so raw. From 1890 is when the manifesto came out saying, okay, let's not do any more plural marriages. It was a revelation against it. Did that mean it totally stopped? No. And of course it took years to kind of figure out, because the government was against plural marriage, and it really did add more because of the government. But by like 1910, in the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints, you'd be excommunicated if you didn't stop living it. And then that's when you got the FLDS church that broke off. And guess what they live today? Spiritual wifery. So if you want to know one of the big differences between how we lived plural marriage and how the FLDS lives it, is they live spiritual wifery, which, people think, oh, it's like that fluid. You're just like, you can be with whoever, and women can be with more men, and men can be with more women, so it's equal. But the women's are never, ever respected in those situations that I found. So in those situations, the FLDS church, the wife had no say. She was forced into it. And it really was the same way back then. And so you do have people being excommunicated for trying to share husbands and wives and not vu, but they're excommunicated. And so it's interesting that Joseph Smith Papers won't talk about that. A lot of other people, because they just sort of want to be smiley and just only talk about the positive stuff. But Meg Stout goes, and she got criticized for it. And then she's not a historian, so I wouldn't trust her, but when you look at the Joseph Smith Papers and all the evidence is there, it's good. But that's just, you have to roll with the punches. And I'm just saying, if what I think is going to happen is going to happen. I'm prepared for it. And just to say, hey, this is my perspective. I'm not perfect. I tried to be nice when I talked to people, when my website kind of blew up a couple years ago, and a lot of people were talking to me, but it just sort of, sorry if I criticized Utah. I always have to be careful. I don't hate Utah. I just don't like going there. And so some people thought I should physically go there. Something I would love to research, if someone, I'm really into music, is just listening to like the chanting of like Jewish chants, and then listening to Native American chanting and seeing, I'm just thinking like the tune and just sort of the sound and the vowels, just how it's not how we sing today. A lot of similarities between those two, but I think there's a lot of things that are going to kind of come out. But there's a lot of evidence for the Book of Mormon. If you study Wayne May, he's got incredible stuff. Rod Meldrum, we just got to be more open-minded. I think the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints, the presidency did address this and say that why can't there be evidence in North, Central, and South America? And that's where I am too. I love researching, there's civilizations that just show up. Adena culture is more like it shows up around the time of the Jaredites. And then the Hopewell culture shows up around 600 BC. But then there's also cultures showing up about 500 BC in South America. Just all of a sudden, this group of people and all this stuff happening, but they can carve a date to that time frame, which in the Book of Mormon says 600 BC. Joseph Smith was not an intellectual. He didn't read. His mother said that he read less than any of his brothers and sisters. I mean, they grew up in a small town. They didn't necessarily go to a library all the time, and libraries were usually they were books in other people's homes. And Joseph didn't read that much. But then the people that helped him write the Book of Mormon said they might have physically wrote it, but it just came out of his mouth. So it's amazing. I don't know. I believe in the Book of Mormon, but I also believe in science and I believe in logic. But I think you can. Some people think you can't, but that's where I'm at. And I'm just asking people to be open-minded, just be nice to each other. And it's okay if you disagree with me. It's fine. Just explain why, and don't just write give up on my page. Don't appreciate that. But anyway, have a good day.
Hey!